Lieutenant Miratan adjusted her helmet, feeling the weight of its sensors and night vision capabilities, and squinted into the dim greenish mist that blanketed the jungle of Vesper 3. Her first week on this alien planet had been tense, colored by the stories whispered among soldiers, tales of the Kolari natives towering, elusive beings who seemed to watch from the jungle but never approached. They become like ghosts, the subject of every story that filled the mess hall at night. No one had encountered one up close, and those who claimed to have seen them spoke in hushed tones, half believing and half dreading. As she stepped into the clearing with her squad, her radio crackled with an incoming message. Command was frantic. A research vessel, on its way to map the outer edges of Vesper 3's dense forests, had crash-landed just beyond the boundaries of the human settlement. Myra's squad was tasked with retrieving the scientists, but they were also warned the crash site was within Kolari territory, a dangerous zone rumored to be sacred to the natives. No one wanted to go. Her squadmates muttered complaints as they double-checked their gear, casting worried glances at the jungle's dark, breathing shadows. Though Mira shared their unease, she held herself steady, knowing it would calm her team. After a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Move out. We don't leave our people behind," she said with quiet authority. Her words held just enough force to push her squad into motion. They moved quickly, darting between thick trees, their suits clanking softly in the mist. The atmosphere seemed almost otherworldly, dense, and oppressive. Everything around them was painted in shades of green and blue, with thick vines hanging like serpents and massive, leaf-like structures reaching skyward. Shadows slipped through the fog, but every time one of them turned to catch a glimpse, the shadows would vanish, as if the jungle itself were alive and watching. About 2 hours into the journey, the jungle's silence shattered. A piercing wail echoed through the trees, making Myra's blood run cold. Instantly, her squad froze, fingers on their triggers, heads swiveling. "Eyes up. Perimeter check." Mira barked, instinctively pulling her rifle to her shoulder. Before anyone could react further, movement erupted from the mist, almost too fast to follow. Something massive and shadowy darted between the trees. Suddenly, the squad wasn't 12 anymore. Soldiers started disappearing, one by one, vanishing into the jungle without a single shot fired, as if the jungle itself were devouring them. A thudding, almost rhythmic sound cut through the chaos, heavy footfalls echoing like war drums. It grew louder, steady and powerful, until it was directly in front of Mira. She tightened her grip, bracing herself for an attack. But when the mist parted, she found herself face to face with something far more unsettling than she'd expected. An 8-foot figure stood before her, its skin a strange, almost metallic blue-gray that glinted faintly under the mist-filtered light. His body was massive, muscular, covered in tattoos or markings that seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence. He had no weapons, but his mere presence was enough to hold Mira in place. His face was broad and severe, with intense, unblinking eyes that seemed to cut right through her. Though his features were alien, there was something ancient and wise in his gaze. Her squad members, those who were still there, took a step back. But Mira, feeling an odd mixture of fear and curiosity, held her ground. Every instinct in her urged her to run, to flee back to the safety of the outpost. But another feeling, just as primal, told her that this was something different. This was not a threat but an invitation. The Kolari lifted his arm slowly, extending a large, open hand toward her. The gesture was unmistakably one of peace. One of her remaining squadmates hissed through clenched teeth. "Lieutenant, don't. Just don't. We need to get out of here." But Mira couldn't pull her gaze from the Kolari's hand. It hung there, waiting. She felt herself compelled forward, as if an invisible force was guiding her. Slowly, she lowered her weapon and extended her hand, placing it in his. As their hands touched, Mira felt a wave of warmth and an overwhelming flood of images, sensations that were not her own. She saw flashes of lush green vistas from a bird's-eye view, felt the grief of losing a close friend in battle, the pride of watching his people thrive peacefully. His memories mixed with hers in a surreal, silent exchange that she couldn't explain. She felt his ancient wisdom, his strength, his sadness, and his hopes. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the visions faded, and she was back in the mist-shrouded jungle, standing face to face with the Kolari. He hadn't spoken a single word, but she felt as though they had just shared an entire conversation. He understood her now, just as she understood him. You're protecting this place," Mira whispered, the words spilling from her lips. The Kolari nodded slowly, his face softening, acknowledging her understanding. It was then that she realized the other members of her squad had disappeared completely, retreating in silent horror back to the base. Mira and the Kolari were alone in the mist, bound together by a strange, unspoken understanding. The Kolari gestured for her to follow, and she obeyed, realizing that this was the moment that would define her time on Vesper 3 and perhaps more than that. Together, they ventured deeper into the Kolari lands, Myra's thoughts racing with questions, but her heart strangely calm. She didn't know what awaited her, but she sensed that her journey with the Kolari would go beyond any mission command had ever assigned. And as the mist swallowed them, Lieutenant Miratan began the first human-Kolari bond that would change everything. Mira had no idea how long they walked. Theric, the name the Kolari had given her through a series of images and impressions, led her through the dense, alien jungle. With each step, the vegetation seemed to grow thicker, the colors deeper, more vibrant. Strange flowers pulsed with bioluminescent light, casting a soft glow on Theric's towering frame. Despite his size, he moved gracefully, almost as if he were gliding across the ground, each step a silent pact with the land around him. Finally, they arrived at a large clearing dominated by a colossal tree, its trunk wide enough to dwarf entire vehicles, its roots twisting around boulders and stretching far into the jungle. It was more than just a tree, it was a monument, a living testament to the Kolari's relationship with this world. Mira could feel it, even without words, the deep reverence Theric felt for this place. It was sacred. As they approached, other Kolari emerged from the shadows, their expressions wary yet curious. They watched Mira with keen, intelligent eyes, their skin displaying a range of hues from slate gray to deep teal. Each of them wore the same intricate tattoos that glowed faintly, marking them in ways Mira suspected conveyed rank, purpose, or history. Theric communicated with them through a series of gestures and subtle glances, calming their tension and indicating Mira as his companion. Mira felt a pang of uncertainty. She was deep in Kolari territory, completely at their mercy. Her training told her to keep her guard up, to analyze every potential threat, but she had to force herself to let go of that instinct. This wasn't a military operation. She was here as a guest, an emissary. Theric had entrusted her with something deeply personal, and she had to meet that trust. He led her to the base of the giant tree, where a circle of Kolari elders awaited. They were older than Theric, their faces etched with countless lines, their tattoos nearly covering their skin, pulsing faintly like veins of light. One of them, the oldest by far, stepped forward, her gaze piercing. Theric made a series of deliberate gestures, and Mira watched, feeling the intensity of the moment but unable to interpret the exchange. Finally, the elder Kolari turned her gaze to Mira, studying her intently. After a long, uncomfortable silence, she spoke a single word in halting Terran standard. "Bond." Mira froze, caught off guard by the clarity and weight of the word. Theric inclined his head, gesturing toward a small circle of stones set around the base of the tree. The other Kolari watched silently, their faces unreadable but their focus intense. Theric reached out his hand to her once more, but this time it was different. This was not a simple greeting or act of reassurance. Mira could sense it was a formal invitation, the first step in the ritual of bonding he had explained through their earlier connection. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a gesture, it was a commitment, a merging of two lives in a way that went beyond any bond she'd ever known. But something deeper inside her urged her on. She had already glimpsed pieces of Theric's memories, felt his grief, his pride, his loyalty. and she sensed he had felt hers as well. This was the only way to truly understand each other. She took his hand. As soon as their hands connected, Mira felt a surge of energy rip through her, raw and overwhelming. Her heart raced, her mind flooded with an onslaught of memories, some familiar, others completely foreign. She saw Therek's childhood, playing in the shadows of these massive trees, his awe of the jungle and its life. She felt his reverence for the natural world, the pain he had suffered losing family to strange human technology, the guarded hope he held for peace between their people. Then, without warning, she felt her own memories slip out, pulled from her mind like loose threads. She saw her earliest years, training with her father on the dusty training fields of her home colony, his stern words and unwavering discipline. She felt her memories of her squad, the quiet camaraderie and the laughter shared over mess hall meals. She saw herself pushing through exhaustion, driven by the unshakable belief that she could make a difference. Then something shifted, and she felt Therek seeing her squad's fear, hearing their dismissal of the Kolari as nothing more than hostiles. She felt his sorrow, and something else, a reluctance, a caution held at bay for her sake. In that instant, she understood the depth of his kindness. The bond deepened, Myra's awareness expanding beyond her physical body, as if her spirit had mingled with the vast network of life rooted in the jungle. She felt the pulse of the trees, the hum of insects, the life breath of the Kolari. And through it all, she felt Therek's presence as a steady, guiding force, anchoring her, giving her strength. Finally, she felt herself return to her body, her senses slowly reorienting, grounding her once more. The jungle around her settled back into stillness, the distant calls of alien birds, the rustling of leaves, the warmth of Therek's hand. She opened her eyes to find him watching her, a look of understanding in his gaze, one that held none of the guarded mystery it had before. "You understand now?" he asked, his voice a deep, resonant timbre that carried an emotion Mira hadn't expected. Hope. "Yes," she replied, her voice thick with the weight of everything she'd just experienced. I understand. You protect this place, not just for yourselves, but for everything that lives here." Therek nodded, and Mira could sense the faintest hint of relief wash over him. "Our world is more than land. We are all connected. Kolari, plant, creature, we are bonded." A new awareness bloomed in Mira, a realization that the Kolari's reverence for life was not merely cultural, it was a bond that transcended survival. The human presence on Vesper 3, with its factories and weapons, its fire and noise, threatened to disrupt that delicate web. Before Mira could say more, a Kolari warrior approached Therek, his expression tight with concern. Myra's mind flickered with residual feelings from Therek. The warrior was warning him, informing him of something urgent. Therek's jaw clenched, and he turned to Mira, his face a mixture of resolve and caution. "Your people come." "More soldiers," he said. The elder Kolari looked on with grave expressions, their faces marked by disappointment and a hint of anger. Myra's heart sank. She had felt the depth of Therek's commitment to peace, the Kolari's desire to coexist without conflict. But her own people didn't understand. They couldn't see the connection she had felt, the life thread that bound the Kolari to their world. If they saw this place as she did, maybe they would approach it differently. But her fellow soldiers had been raised in an environment of suspicion and caution, seeing only the unfamiliar as potential threat. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet Therek's gaze. "I have to try," she said softly. "I have to go back. If I don't, they'll come for us with more force. They don't understand." Therek held her gaze, and for a long moment she saw the struggle in his expression. But he nodded, understanding the risk she was willing to take. "We trust you, Mira. We believe you can speak for us." The words filled her with a strange warmth and a heavy sense of responsibility. She was just one soldier, one voice among thousands, but she knew what this place meant now, and she couldn't ignore that. As she turned to leave, Therek reached out, pressing his hand to her shoulder. "The bond does not end here. Take it with you. Share it." Mira nodded, her heart pounding as she stepped back into the jungle, the ancient Kolari tree standing tall and unwavering behind her, a living reminder of what she now understood. She knew that her path back to her own people would not be easy, but with the bond between her and Theric pulsing inside her, she walked back toward the human outpost, prepared to fight for the peace they both wanted so desperately to protect. Myra's return to the outpost wasn't what she'd hoped. She'd imagined that her newfound understanding of the Kolari, the intricate, life-bound connection she now shared with Theric, would open the door to cooperation. Instead, she was met with suspicion, hostility, and fear. The moment she stepped into the main operations center, a murmur spread through her fellow soldiers. Eyes tracked her as if she were an intruder. Sergeant Alton, a tall, grizzled officer known for his firm stance on alien containment, confronted her immediately. "Lieutenant Tan, what in hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice low but seething with anger. His gaze swept over her, taking in the slight dirt stains on her uniform, the torn patches, and the distant look in her eyes. "You abandoned your squad, fraternized with a hostile. And now you show up, waltzing back like you haven't betrayed every protocol we have." Mira bit her lip, trying to keep her composure. "It's not like that, Sergeant. I was with the Kolari leader, Theric. He wants peace. They're protecting their territory, and I understand why now. They only want to coexist." Alton narrowed his eyes. "Protecting their territory? Lieutenant, we're here on official Terragov orders. This land was deemed resource abundant. And you're talking about bonding with some alien who's probably brainwashed you." "They aren't just aliens, sir," she said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "The Kolari are deeply connected to this land. They feel everything that happens here as if it's happening to them. Our presence disrupts that connection. If we don't approach this carefully, we're going to set off a conflict that could cost us more than we're willing to lose." Alton laughed bitterly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Spoken like a true traitor. You sound more like one of them than one of us, Lieutenant." He turned to address the nearby soldiers, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Lieutenant Tan has been compromised. She's sympathizing with the enemy. I want her under observation until we can figure out just how deep her bonding with these creatures goes." Myra's stomach churned. She knew it wouldn't be easy to convince them, but she hadn't expected to be treated like a traitor. Before she could argue, Alton stepped back, gesturing to two soldiers standing nearby. "Take her to holding," he ordered. The soldiers, looking uncertain but obedient, grabbed her by the arms. As they led her down the hallway, she felt a mixture of frustration, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. She'd expected pushback, but being treated like an enemy by her own comrades was harder than she'd anticipated. Once inside the bare, cold cell, Mira leaned her head against the wall, her mind racing. She could still feel the connection with Theric, a faint warmth in the back of her mind that reassured her, reminding her that she wasn't truly alone. He was aware of her situation, she realized, sensing his quiet determination. He trusted her to bridge the gap between their worlds, and she wouldn't abandon that mission no matter the cost. Hours passed in silence. She was left alone, with only the muffled sounds of the outpost's activity drifting in and out as soldiers moved by. She knew they were debating what to do with her, perhaps considering her mental state compromised by Kolari influence. Her heart sank as she realized how thin the line was between loyalty and suspicion. Suddenly, the sound of boots approached her cell, and the door creaked open. Sergeant Alton strode in, his face tense and shadowed by something darker than mere distrust. "You have a choice, Tan," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're going to lead us to Theric and his people. We've decided to neutralize the Kolari threat. We're done waiting for them to attack." Myra's blood ran cold. "You can't do that. They haven't done anything to warrant an attack. They've been defending their territory, just as we would." Alton ignored her, leaning in close. You've seen them. You've bonded with them, whatever that means. That makes you our best bet for finding them. So here's the deal. You're going to help us find their base, or you're going to stay here under suspicion of treason. And if you think that's an empty threat, try me. Myra's mind raced. She knew that leading them to the Kolari would lead to bloodshed, and it would violate the very trust Theric had extended to her. But if she refused, they'd storm the Kolari territory anyway, prepared to strike at any sign of resistance. She straightened her shoulders, summoning every ounce of defiance she had. I won't help you destroy them. Alton's jaw clenched, his eyes cold. Then I'll consider you an enemy sympathizer, Lieutenant. You'll be held here until you come to your senses. He turned to leave, but Myra's voice stopped him. At least let me speak to the commander. There's more at stake here than you realize. The Kolari aren't just defending themselves. They're bonded to this land. Any conflict we start will be a disaster for both sides. Alton sneered. I'm done hearing you preach alien nonsense. You've made your bed, Tan. As he stormed out, slamming the cell door shut behind him, Mira felt a flicker of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. The connection with Theric still hummed within her, and she reached for it, allowing herself to focus on the warmth, the shared understanding that had grown between them. With a sudden flash of insight, she realized Theric was trying to reach her not just to comfort her, but to send a message. Closing her eyes, she focused on the bond, feeling a surge of understanding wash over her. Theric was aware of the threat, and he was preparing. He wasn't alone. The Kolari Council, the governing elders of his people, were readying for the worst. They had no choice but to defend their lands. Myra's heart sank. The Kolari were peaceful, but they were not defenseless. They had their own ways of warfare, honed over generations, a mixture of strategy and their deep connection to the natural world. The humans would be walking into a trap, but even so, she feared the Kolari might be overwhelmed by sheer numbers and firepower. She couldn't let that happen. As the minutes ticked by, she forced herself to think through her options. Her loyalty was clear, but her duty was to protect lives on both sides. She couldn't save the Kolari by herself, but she could stall the human advance long enough to warn Theric and his people. A faint sound at her door interrupted her thoughts. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. To her astonishment, Private Elara, one of her younger squadmates, peeked inside, her expression a mix of nerves and resolve. "Lieutenant," she whispered, glancing down the hallway. "I know you're telling the truth about the Kolari. Some of us. We've seen them too. They're not the monsters Command thinks they are." Myra's heart leapt. She wasn't alone after all. "Elara, I need to warn Theric. We have to stop this before it turns into a massacre." Elara nodded. "I'm in. But we'll have to move quickly. Alton's prepping a strike team. They're planning to hit the Kolari lands at dawn." Together, Mira and Elara slipped out of the cell, navigating the shadows of the outpost with a careful precision only soldiers could manage. A few other sympathetic soldiers joined them along the way, forming a small group who believed in Myra's vision of peace. As they neared the jungle edge, Mira glanced back at the outpost, its cold lights casting a pale glow against the dark sky. She knew she might never return, that by leaving, she was committing herself to a life of constant mistrust. But the bond with Theric, the connection that pulsed inside her, strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for the Kolari, she was fighting for a future where both species could coexist. They vanished into the jungle, moving swiftly and silently, following the path Mira had memorized. As they neared the Kolari heartland, Mira felt the bond with Theric intensify. He was waiting, aware of her presence, and ready. The night was filled with tension as they prepared for what lay ahead. In the quiet, Myra's mind churned with worry for the Kolari, for the soldiers she'd left behind, for the cost this standoff would demand. Dawn was coming, and with it, a battle neither side could afford to lose. Mira and her small group of sympathizers moved swiftly and silently through the dense jungle, their senses sharpened by the threat of the advancing strike team behind them. As they neared the Kolari heartland, Mira felt the pulse of her bond with Theric grow stronger, as if he were guiding her path through the twisting vines and towering trees. Finally, they reached the edge of the Kolari sanctuary. Towering trees encircled a clearing where Kolari warriors stood ready, their powerful, silent presence amplified by the faint glow of their tattoos, marking them like spirits of the jungle. The Kolari Council elders were there as well, their faces grave, reflecting both pride and sorrow at the conflict that loomed. Theric stepped forward, his gaze locking with Myra's. Relief and determination radiated through their bond, mingling with the weight of the difficult choices that lay ahead. His words echoed in her mind through their connection, carrying more meaning than mere language could convey. "You came, despite the danger. Thank you, Mira." Mira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the urgency she felt. "Theric, we don't have much time. The humans are on their way, heavily armed, led by my commanding officer. They're expecting resistance, and they're prepared to respond with deadly force." Theric's expression darkened. "We had hoped to avoid this. But if they come to destroy us, we will defend our home. It is our way, Mira. This land is our bond, our spirit. We cannot abandon it." A somber understanding passed between them. Mira knew that the Kolari couldn't leave their home any more than a tree could uproot itself to escape danger. But she also knew her people, and that the Kolari's defensive stance would only confirm the worst suspicions of the soldiers marching toward them. As the Kolari warriors prepared their defenses, Mira realized she had one last chance to stop this conflict. She turned to Theric, grasping his arm. "Let me speak to my commander. If I can make him understand. Maybe there's still hope." Theric hesitated, searching her face. Finally, he nodded. "Go. But we will not back down, Mira. Our people are prepared to fight if they must." Nodding, Mira took off through the jungle, Alara and the others at her side. The sounds of marching boots, crunching branches, and distant voices soon filled the air. They came upon the strike team just as they entered Kolari territory, their weapons at the ready, expression steely with resolve. At the lead was Sergeant Alton, his face set in grim determination, his rifle already raised. He spotted Mira instantly, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of anger and shock. "Lieutenant Tan, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in holding. And with a group of deserters, no less." His voice was cold, dismissive. Mira stepped forward, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "Sergeant, listen to me. The Kolari aren't our enemies. They only want to defend their land, their way of life. If we attack, they'll defend themselves, but they're not looking for conflict." Alton scoffed, his gaze hardening. "That's easy for you to say. You're one of them now, aren't you? Bonded or brainwashed, I don't know which, and I don't care. They're in the way of Terragil's plans, and we have orders to secure this region." Mira took a steadying breath, meeting Alton's cold stare. "Do you hear yourself? In the way. You're talking about a people with lives, history, a culture that's just as meaningful as ours. You think they're primitive because they don't use technology like we do, but they understand this planet in ways we never could. They're bonded to it, and to each other. This isn't just land to them, it's their lifeblood." Alton's expression flickered, but he shook his head. "You're blinded, Tan. They filled your head with fairy tales. We have a mission. Our people back on Terragil depend on the resources here. We're not abandoning it over some jungle natives." The soldiers around him shifted uncomfortably, some casting glances at Mira, others looking away, clearly troubled by her words. In a last desperate attempt, Mira took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Sergeant, if you move forward, you'll be leading these soldiers into a fight they don't understand. I've felt what the Kolari feel, their connection to this place. They will protect it at all costs. And if we keep pushing, it's only a matter of time before they retaliate on a scale we can't control. Alton's eyes hardened. I don't take orders from you, Lieutenant. Step aside, or I'll have you restrained and returned to base. She felt a surge of panic and despair, but fought to keep her voice steady. Then you'll have to go through me. She raised her chin, a new sense of courage settling over her, one drawn from her bond with Theric and the Kolari. She wasn't just protecting an alien race, she was protecting the chance for two worlds to find common ground. Alton took a step toward her, jaw clenched, but before he could speak, a low, resonant sound rippled through the jungle. Every soldier froze. It was the Kolari war cry, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the ground itself, reverberating up through the trees and into their bones. From the shadows, Kolari warriors emerged, surrounding the strike team. They held no guns, but their massive forms, bristling with strength and resolve, were enough to make even the most battle-hardened soldiers flinch. Theric stepped forward, his gaze locked on Alton. He spoke slowly, his voice deep and measured, carrying the weight of his people's history. We do not wish to harm you, humans. But we will not abandon our home. It is sacred to us. Your violence will not break us. Alton's face blanched, but he held his rifle steady, his finger hovering near the trigger. One wrong move, alien, and I'll dash. But Mira stepped between them, her voice fierce. If you fire, you'll condemn us all. You don't understand, Sergeant. You think they're just an obstacle, but you're facing an entire people, united and ready to fight for what they believe in. This isn't just a tactical skirmish. This is a war of survival for them. And for us. Alton hesitated, his gaze flickering between Mira and Theric. Slowly, doubt crept into his eyes as the reality of their situation settled over him. The Kolari weren't just hostiles. They were a civilization bound to this land in a way that went beyond ownership. They would fight with a strength that no tactical advantage could overcome. With her heart pounding, Mira reached out, placing a hand on Alton's shoulder. Sergeant, stand down. Just this once, let's find a solution that doesn't end in bloodshed. A tense silence hung over the clearing. Alton glanced around at his soldiers, seeing their expressions torn between fear and hope. He exhaled sharply, the fight draining from his face. Slowly, he lowered his rifle, and one by one, the other soldiers followed his lead. Mira felt a wave of relief, so strong it almost knocked her off balance. She turned to Theric, who nodded, his expression a mixture of respect and understanding. With the strike averted, Mira and Theric gathered the elders and Alton's team to negotiate. Mira acted as a bridge between them, relaying Theric's requests and explaining the Kolari's bond with the land in terms the soldiers could understand. The meeting stretched long into the evening, with both sides sharing stories, asking questions, and, for the first time, seeing each other not as enemies but as individuals. As dawn approached, a tentative agreement was reached. Teragov would set strict boundaries around Kolari lands, with Mira as the official liaison to ensure that neither side's territory was violated. Resources would be shared in a way that respected the Kolari's environment, and the Kolari would allow limited human access to certain areas for research and exploration. When the soldiers finally began their journey back to the outpost, Mira felt the weight of what they had accomplished settle over her. This wasn't a victory in the conventional sense, but it was a victory of understanding, a fragile first step toward coexistence. Theric turned to her before they parted, his gaze filled with a quiet gratitude. You have proven that courage is more than strength, Mira. Courage is understanding. And in that, you have changed more than you realize. Mira nodded, feeling the bond between them pulse with renewed strength. She wasn't just a soldier anymore, she was part of something greater, a link between two worlds. And as she walked back to her own people, she felt a new sense of purpose guiding her, one that transcended the boundaries of species, rank, and duty. Together, they had forged a peace that would protect the Kolari's ancient lands and open a future of understanding and respect. And in the mist-filled jungle of Vesper 3, a bond between a human and a Kolari giant had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come.